Hi, I'm Graham Opie, CEO at MND New South Wales. Firstly, I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this education takes place, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Welcome to Ask the Experts 2020. MND New South Wales has organised this event almost every year since 2004. This year, we're hosting Ask the Experts online for the very first time. We have 4 speakers giving 3 presentations today, all experts in their field. All the presenters are here live, however, their presentations are pre-recorded. As I mentioned, presenters are live online in the background and are ready to answer your questions after their presentation is concluded. You can ask your questions from wherever you're viewing, either Facebook or YouTube. Simply write your question as a comment. We may not have time to answer all your questions today, but we will do our best. The presenters will also come together in a panel style at the end so that you can ask more questions you can think of. This is your opportunity to quiz the experts. We hope today will go smoothly, as this is the first time we've used live stream technology for Ask the Experts. We'd be interested in your feedback after the session. Please be aware that some of the presenters' internet quality is better than others, but at all times the audio is clear. I'd like to thank all of our presenters today who've given their time so freely, and it's included a number of practice sessions, pre-recording, and being available to answer your questions today. We welcome people living with MND, family, friends, and we also know there are health professionals tuning in. We welcome you all. I'd like to start off by introducing Ashley Crook and Rosie Fell, who are presenting together on the genetics of MND, what it means to me. Ashley and Rosie are genetic counsellors at MQ Health Neurology and the Macquarie MND Research Centre. They both have masters in genetic counselling. Ashley is a certified counsellor and is currently a PhD student at the University of Technology, Sydney. Through her PhD project, she's aiming to develop an improved model of care for genetic counselling of MND and frontotemporal dementia. She's been working with people living with MND and their families since 2015. Rosie works directly with patients and their families in the clinic and also works closely with the research team to ensure relevant clinical data is known. Thank you, Ashley and Rosie.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. My name's Ashley. I'm one of the genetic counsellors in the team at Macquarie, and I'm excited to talk to you today about the genetics of motor neurone disease. And I really want to focus on what that genetics means to you and other family members. I'll be doing the first half of the presentation today, and then I'll be handing over to my colleague Rosie, who will take us through the second half. So my job today will be talking about these top 4 points, about the causes of MND, the genetics and genetic testing involved in MND, and genetic counselling, which is, I guess, a support through genetic testing decision-making. And then I'll be handing over to Rosie, who will talk us through an example case of David, a man with MND who is deciding about whether or not to go ahead with testing. And we'll also have some resources for accessing more information should you want to investigate anything further for yourself. So firstly, it's worth me starting by talking about familial and sporadic MND. We know that about 5 to 10% of cases of MND are considered familial. And what that means is that perhaps there might be multiple family members who are susceptible to MND in the family. So in the past family history, there might be people who have developed MND, and we can see that going through the generations as well. Sometimes there might be other similar conditions like frontotemporal dementia or FTD, and I'll explain a bit about that condition in the next slide. In people with familial MND, there is usually, it's expected to be an underlying change in a DNA that can be inherited that would explain why there is a susceptibility to family. But what we currently know is that not all genes that are associated with familial MND have been discovered. So we can currently only find the answer for about 2/3 of cases of familial MND. The other thing that's a bit interesting about familial MND is that although people in the family might have the same change in their DNA, there are variabilities. So there might be a number of family members with the same change in their DNA, but different ages of diagnosis or presentation of disease. So genetic change gives us some information, but not always the full picture. The majority of cases of MND, though, are considered sporadic, and that means that the cause is mostly unknown. There are some theories like exposure to toxins or infections, but generally there is no primary cause known at this point in time. The thing that's important to remember, though, is that even people with sporadic disease may actually have familial MND, meaning that they may actually have a genetic change that has caused the MND to happen in them, even if there isn't a strong family history. So I'll be walking through the genetic testing and the complexities of the genes involved in the next few slides. And then Rosie can talk a bit more about the case of David, which is someone who sits between the border of being a potentially sporadic or a familial case. So before I go on, I need to talk about frontotemporal dementia, because this is a condition that is linked with motor neurone disease. And currently we think about these conditions to be on a continuum. So we've got MND on one side and frontotemporal dementia on the other. People with FTD might have changes in their behaviour, personality, or language. And we know that some people with MND will also be diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia in around 10% of cases. We also know that some people with MND may have some changes like FTD, like some small changes in their behaviour, personality, or language, and that's where they sit along the continuum. The other thing that's important to know is, as well as the clinical similarities that we might see between MND and FTD, there are also genetic similarities. So here in this slide, I really want to highlight some complexities that we understand about the genetics of MND and FTD. We've got some genes which are quite well known now in MND, like SOD1, and similar for FTD, we've got MAPT. And then we've got genes in the middle like C9orf72, which are associated with both MND and FTD. These genes can have a number of different reasons why they cause problems or why they cause disease to happen in someone. And the other thing that's important to note is that there are many missing puzzle pieces. So we don't have a full, complete understanding of the genetics of MND at this point in time. That's constantly changing. And just to highlight how it's constantly changing, we see here the first gene, SOD1, was discovered in 1993, but our understanding has continued to increase as the years go on, as genetic technology has improved and we're able to search more families at a much faster rate than ever before. So genetic testing, so searching for some of these genes that I've listed, could be important for you as a person with MND, because if we do find that there is a genetic change, it could help to explain why MND occurred. And although not currently available, there may be some future treatment options that may be useful, such as clinical trials. In other parts of the world, there are some clinical trials targeted specifically at people who have specific changes in their DNA that have caused MND to happen. And there are phase 3 trials currently running in different parts of the world. The other side, though, is that testing could be useful for other family members. So if we were to identify a genetic change in you, then other family members could have testing if they wanted to determine whether they have also inherited that increased risk. There are pros and cons of going ahead with this type of testing, which is part of our job to discuss these things. I guess although currently there's no change to medical management, we can't predict the onset of MND in someone. Some people might use predictive testing to help plan their future. And an example of planning their future might be that if someone was aware that they had inherited an increased susceptibility to MND, they might choose to prevent passing on the genetic change to future generations using reproductive genetic testing through IVF, for example. Genetic testing itself is a fairly simple process. It's a blood test. Usually we start testing on someone with MND, and Rosie will go into that example later. But I guess the important thing to know is that results can take months, and as the genetics is complicated, you could do a test for a single gene or you could test a number of genes, and there are pros and cons of each of these options. So part of the discussion about genetic testing really should involve some aspect of genetic counselling. you may not have heard of genetic counselling. So I really want to outline that it really incorporates these 4 areas. So first, interpretation of family and medical histories, education about the condition, support and resources, counselling to promote informed choice, and support to encourage the best possible adjustment. Genetic counselling is something that can be provided by a number of different health professionals like neurologists, GP, psychologists, but as genetic counsellors ourselves, it's part of our training to incorporate all 4 aspects of genetic counselling into our practice, where we work people through genetic testing decision making. And at Macquarie University, at the clinic there is a multidisciplinary MND clinic, and genetic counsellors now form part of that clinic, along with other health professionals to help with MND care. So I'm going to finish here, and then I'm going to hand over to Rosie, who will talk us through an example case, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ashley. Now we're going to move into a time of actually looking at how some of that information might relate to an individual. So meet David. David is aged 55 and has recently been diagnosed with motor neurone disease. His neurologist, whilst taking a detailed medical history, also asked David some questions about his family and about their health. Of interest, David's mother died quite young in a car accident, and David's mother's mother was wheelchair-bound before she passed away in her 60s. And whilst David doesn't know why she was in a wheelchair, he also believes that she had had some changes in her behaviour as well. So his neurologist thinks that perhaps there could be something more to his motor neurone disease. He suggests that David actually meet with a genetic counsellor to go through his family history a bit in greater detail. So David meets with a genetic counsellor who asks David some further questions about his family history, and David has been able to speak with his aunt and gain a little bit more information about that his aunt also had an uncle who had dementia in the family, and while she didn't know how long he'd had it for or how old he was when he died, she was able to just give that little bit more information that David passed on to the genetic counsellor. So the genetic counsellor drew up this family tree that you can see here, just to give a bit more information about the wider family. The genetic counsellor also felt from this that there was the possibility that there might be a genetic cause to David's motor neurone disease, and so they proceeded to go ahead with discussions about testing. So the genetic counsellor went through the pros and cons of testing with him and with a significant other. In this case, it was David's wife, Jennifer. And they wanted to make sure that both David and his wife understood the implications of going ahead with any genetic testing, not just for David, but also for the wider family. So a detection of a known DNA chain may provide David with an answer, with a cause for his motor neurone disease. But although there is currently no effective treatment or preventative options, a DNA change may also give access to future treatment trials. It also provides information for family members about their own risk of developing motor neurone disease or frontotemporal dementia, as Ashley mentioned, provide them with options to possibly look at doing predictive testing and or any family in the future. The other side of this, though, is that a DNA change would solidify an otherwise hypothetical for the family members of developing motor neurone disease, but without actually providing any current options to actually manage the risk. So this may cause David to feel guilty about being one that has identified a DNA change in the family, and may cause David or his relatives to be a bit worried about a possible risk to family members. So the absence of a DNA change, in this case, might provide some reassurance to David and his relatives that perhaps it's not there's not a genetic cause for his disease, but it wouldn't completely rule out an inherited risk for David and his family. And as Ashley mentioned, it does take time for the result to come back, and so that time waiting for the results can be anxiety provoking. In our experience, a genetic diagnosis doesn't aid in the prediction of a prognosis for David, nor would it give his family any prediction of age of onset of symptoms or a diagnosis for any other family members. So what are David's options? He could proceed with testing, or he could decide to decline testing, and he could do something called deferring of testing. So if he was to proceed with testing, it doesn't necessarily mean that David will get an answer. As I actually explained earlier, there's a lot that we don't know about the genetics of motor neurone disease, and a test may detect a DNA change in a known gene, or it may not. And if no gene is identified, then does that mean that it's David's MND isn't familial? Well, maybe, but maybe not. It's also possible that David's MND has been caused by a gene that we haven't identified as yet. So there's lots of different outcomes that could come from actually proceeding with testing, including what we call a DNA change of uncertain significance, which might actually result in more questions being asked rather than answers for David and his family. So it's all things that are worth considering when pursuing testing. So David could decide to decline testing, and in which case there'd be no closer to knowing whether or not there's an inherited risk for his family, but testing would be unavailable then to his relatives who might be interested in finding out more about their own risk. So if he decided to decline testing, then we would often recommend that perhaps looking into deferring of testing is a good option, because deferring of testing allows us to arrange for storage of his DNA sample that could be used then for future testing by the family sometime down the track. So there's a lot of information that gets discussed in an appointment with a genetic counsellor. And so genetic counsellors can help to answer questions and concerns that David and his family may have. And we really encourage David and his wife Jennifer to speak to the wider family about what their thoughts are about pursuing genetic testing. So in this case, David and his wife do speak to their children, and their daughter is really interested, and she wants to know a bit more about options, and particularly for her as she and her partner are looking to start a family in the not too distant future. So she's quite interested and is keen for her father to go ahead with testing. Whereas when they speak with their son, he is a bit more sort of less interested and doesn't think he'd really want to know for himself. He already has a family, and he doesn't think that he'd change his life plans with this information. You can see that there are different outcomes of how people look at this information, and so it does make it difficult for people to make a decision about whether to proceed with testing. What does David decide to do? Well, to be fair, there's actually no right or wrong answer here, and genetic counselling is really there to support an individual and their family through making this decision. It's really important that David and the family feel supported throughout, and genetic counsellors can be there to help with family discussions and help people to see things from everybody's point of view. So in summary, genetic testing can provide an answer for a small proportion of patients with motor neurone disease. You remember back from the beginning of Ashley's talk where she talked about familial motor neurone disease making up about 5 to 10% of motor neurone disease. And whilst currently the testing doesn't change the management, it may do so in the future, and there may be those trials that Ashley mentioned. So genetic counsellors are really there to support patients and their families through the genetic testing process, including all the decision-making, communication with others, support and in the adjustment to any result being identified and what that means and how to share that with the wider family. So just finally, where else can you guys go for more information if you are looking for it? So one option would be to go to a multidisciplinary MND team, such as the team here at Macquarie, and you can see us all up there in the corner. If that's not available to you, then visiting a genetics unit through your local health district is possible, and the Centre for Genetics Education website that's pictured here It shows you where those services are available in different states and territories around Australia. Some more information, the MND Australia website also has this fact sheet on familial motor neurone disease and genetic testing, so that can be a source of further information there too. And the one other one I was going to point out is this MND Decision Tools website that also has a section that's predominantly for predictive testing, and so for family members that might not have the condition but want to look at it for themselves. And that gives you them lots of things to think about in terms of proceeding with those with predictive testing. And if you had any other questions and wanted to contact Ashley or myself directly, then our contact details are there on the screen. But thank you for your time. And now Ashley and I are looking forward to answering any questions that you might have for us.
Right, well, look, thank you so much for all the questions that have been coming in. They've been fantastic. We'll do our best to answer those ones. We've had one come in from Facebook. From Sun asks about the outcome of genetic testing having insurance implications. So yes, that is something that we do need to consider before doing any genetic testing. So genetic testing in Australia has no impact on our health insurances, but it can have an impact on your life insurance policies. So and the sort of permanent disability type policies as well. So you do need to make reference to that in taking out a policy. So what we recommend to people to do is to actually take out a policy before talking to anyone about doing genetic testing, because that way, once you have an existing policy in place, obviously you've not done any testing at that time to report back. And if you make no changes to that policy, then you don't need to go back to your insurer that information. So the next question, Ash, do you want to do that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks for your question, Eric. Does genetic testing create much friction within families, and how to deal with this if friction is present? I guess that encompasses part of our role as genetic counsellors. So every family we meet is different dynamics, different communication, different histories, both family, health histories, but also other histories in the family, and we need to take all of these things into account when we are working with the people in front of us and their families. So it varies, and I guess the entire idea of us being involved in the genetic testing process, or at least someone providing genetic counselling while you do have genetic testing, is to ensure that if those things are there, that they are addressed as best as they can be, and that the decision that is made about whether or not to proceed with testing, whether or not to share the information, all of those things are considered very specific to you and your family.
So what's the process for genetic testing, and how can you organise a genetic test for MND? So the process for testing is you do need to meet with a genetic counsellor to be able to talk through having the test and all the ins and outs of that. But in terms of the actual testing, it is just a blood test like any other sort of regular test. But as we mentioned in the talk, it does take quite a long time for those results to come back. It's just there is a bit of a wait time just through complex of how do you organise your genetic. So you can talk with your neurologist. Not all neurologists have genetic counsellors that work with them, like we do here at Macquarie. But your neurologist or your GP can refer you to a local genetic service through your local health district. And they can arrange the testing, and you can meet with a genetic counsellor through there.
Good question. Is MND hereditary? I guess what is important to know is that MND is a word for the entire condition, but it's very variable. So we know that different people have different reasons for why they developed MND. A small proportion is hereditary, meaning familial, about 5 to 10% of cases. And that is mostly with people who do have family histories that includes more than one relative with MND or another similar condition like frontotemporal dementia. And I guess the majority of cases of MND are sporadic, meaning that we don't have a reason as to why the MND occurred in that person. Perhaps in future we will have a better understanding about why that happened. Oh, another question for me. Ashley said it might take months to get results. Why is that? Great question. Genetic testing is much faster than it used to be, but it's certainly not so prompt. So what we know is that there's a number of genes involved in motor neurone disease, and there is no one test that can test, everything together. So, for example, the C9orf72 gene often needs to be tested separately to the other MND genes. And the testing takes so long because actually in the laboratory it does take so long. There's a lot of steps that need to be taken to make sure that the result is accurate. And often it is just the time needed to get a result is a decent amount of time.
Hi, next question. In percentage terms, what genetics would play a part in MND? I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there, Hayden. I think you're asking the sporadic condition is about 90% of people with MND, and the familial is about 10% of people with MND. So really that's, but if you're meaning then what the genetics, I mean, there's lots that we still need to understand about how the genetics works and how the effect of other genes can result in sporadic condition. And sometimes what looks like a sporadic case has been known to find a genetic cause as well, there's been no sign of that within a family. So, but in terms of a percentage of that, that's quite rare. So, yeah.
Now, the final question, is FTD or frontotemporal dementia the same as any other form of dementia? This is a fantastic question, and I probably could have been clearer in my presentation. So frontotemporal dementia is a very specific form of dementia. It's in the early stages, it's associated with changes in behaviour, personality and language. I guess when you think about other dementias like Alzheimer's, you might be thinking about memory loss in the early stages. So it's quite a different clinical feature, but also quite a different underlying pathology. So because of that different underlying pathology, FTD is really the main one that we know that is linked to motor neurone disease. But there are, often questions that come up about whether other neurological conditions, for example, could be linked with motor neurone disease. And the big one is frontotemporal dementia. We know that MND and FTD sit along a spectrum, but there is definitely research looking into whether there are other similarities, because we know other neurological conditions do have shared clinical features. So, for example, when you are trying to diagnose someone with motor neurone disease, you might be ruling out other neurological conditions that might have those features. So, yeah, I hope that helps to answer your question. Thanks very much. That's our final question. We're going to get on to Gethin next, and we'll be back for the panel later on. Thanks.
Thanks.
MND Australia. Gethin has over 20 years' experience as a biomedical researcher, publishing more than 65 papers. Gethin has been director of the research office at Charles Sturt University, directed higher degree by research programs at Charles Sturt and the University of Queensland, and was an associate dean of research at the University of Queensland. Gethin joined MND Australia 12 months ago as executive director of research. His core priorities for the near future involve maintaining grant funding through the COVID-19 crisis, building stronger national and international partnerships, and implementing the new MND Australia strategy. Today, Gethin is going to give an overview of Australian MND research. Thanks, Gethin.
Right, thank you for that introduction, and it's a really great pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to talk to you about Australian MND research and what is happening here and around the world. So, Motor Neuron Disease Research Australia is the research arm of MND Australia, and it was established in 1984 as a national organisation to promote MND research. We gave out our first research grant in and we formally amalgamated with MND Australia in 2010. And just last month, we renamed ourselves from the MND Research Institute of Australia, which many of you will be familiar with, to MND Research Australia, as better reflecting our status as the national research body and also reflecting our alignment with MND Australia. So, what research, what do we fund? We have been raising funds, as I said, since 1988. And here's a snapshot of the last 15 years or so. And as you can see, we've gone from just raising a couple of $100,000 a year, right up to in 2018, we had our best year ever where we raised $4 million for research. And as all of you may well be aware, every dollar we raise for research goes directly into research. We don't spend it on overheads, etc. And we have a number of ways in which we fundraise. The state associations are incredibly generous, and MND New South Wales help support the Paul Bruck research grant as well as the Run MND research grant. And so we're always very, very appreciative of the states, how they help us out. So we have that money, so what do we actually spend it on? So we have a range of different research grants. We support scholarships and fellowships to really capacity build within the research field to make sure our researchers are actually supported. So we have new young researchers coming through all the time, and then we support project grants and larger projects as well. So that's the actual research projects that get done to actually make the advances. Research ranges right from early discovery research through the preclinical stage and clinical trials, as well as healthcare research. We do a lot of, in the discovery stage, we're looking at things like epidemiology, genetics, to identify new genes, cell biology, what changes in the neurons themselves are contributing to disease, metabolism and immunology as well. Part of this, we've funded SALSA, which is the Sporadic ALS Australia System Genomics Consortium. And these guys are collecting as many samples as they can from MND patients and controls to work out to genetically profile these patients to identify what may give us more insights into what causes the disease. In preclinical research, we do a lot of supportive projects where they look at testing potential drugs in the very early stages. We did this with, say, copper ATSM, which is now in clinical trial, PMX205, which is just about to commence a trial in the US as well. And they test potential drugs in cells and in animal models as well. In clinical research, we support trials that look at developing biomarkers. These are really critical for MND research. Better biomarkers will allow us to identify the disease diagnosis much earlier, which is a real critical problem at the moment, as well as follow the disease. And a really important aspect of that is we can follow how the disease is progressing. We can see better how patients respond to trial treatments. The better we can see that, obviously, the better we can judge how well a drug is working. We also have managed to support some early stage clinical trials. And recently we supported the Lighthouse project, which was a phase 2 clinical trial of Triumec, which is an antiretroviral drug. And that showed very promising results from the phase 2 trial and has now moved into a phase 3 trial that is about to start very soon in several countries around the world, including Australia. We also support research in healthcare. A key aspect of this is non-invasive ventilation. David Berlowitz from Melbourne has just received $3.5 million from the Medical Research Future Fund to move this research into clinical practice. And he's already demonstrated that non-invasive ventilation is the most effective way of increasing life expectancy in patients. And we have helped him along the way to produce that data, and this is now spun into a $3.5 million grant, which is very gratifying to see. We're also funding research into patient communication. How well do patients understand the literature and the information presented to them? And also palliative care areas as well, to support carers who are providing palliative care. All of this combines towards us working towards this world without MND. What people are really, really interested in the end is better treatments and potential cures for MND. This is a very complex area, obviously. So here we have the standard clinical trial pipeline. This really applies across the board to all diseases, not just MND. And you can see there in the early drug discovery phases, we start off with, say, 10,000 compounds, and only 250 of these will actually progress into the preclinical stage. And of those 250, only 5 will actually make it into the actual clinical trials. And we hope that one of those then will come through and actually provide an approved drug. So this obviously is a very attritional process, and you need to have a very well supported, broad pipeline going in, because there is such a high rate of attrition in these drugs. But the really good news is at the moment there are currently, I think, over 70 trials in MND and ALS currently underway in these clinical trial phases. So they've passed through the drug discovery and the preclinical, which are the really attritional phases, and we now have a number of drugs in the pipeline. This is really important because by having so many drugs in there, we're covering a number of different aspects of the disease. So where are the next drugs coming from? What aspects of the disease are we focusing on? So muscle wastage. Obviously, a lot of patients lose a lot of muscle, so there's drugs that are looking to attenuate that. A kind of burgeoning area is the inflammation, immune system, and neuroinflammation. There's been a lot of interest in this developing in the last few years, and now there's some drugs that are looking whether they can reduce this neuroinflammation, and hopefully that will stop the destruction of the neurons. Information that's come from all the genetic studies has shown there's defects in RNA processing within the cells of the neurons. So there's a number of drugs being developed at the moment that are trying to fix these defects in RNA processing. These are molecular mechanisms happening within the cells that control the activity of the cells. Protein accumulation seems to happen a lot in neurons, and that causes toxicity. It kills the neurons. So there are a number of drugs being looked at the moment that help improve the clearance of these proteins from the cells. Stem cells, everyone's probably heard of neurone and the brainstorm trials. So these are currently underway, and there's some very promising phase 2 data, and there's a phase 3 trial that is currently underway. And I believe they've just completed all the patient recruitment. So within a few months, we hope to hear the outcomes of this trial. As I mentioned before, the Lighthouse trial looking at retroviral load in patients. So patients carry high levels of retroviruses, and this trial is investigating whether reducing those retroviral loads will actually improve disease outcome in these patients. These are just a number of different ways in which the drugs in the clinical trial pipeline are trying to develop better treatments for those patients with MND. So what do I think are the key exciting areas at the moment? There's 2 aspects I'd like to just talk to you about today. So platform trials. This is an approach that's been taken from cancer trials. So instead of the standard clinical trial, you have a group of patients receiving a drug and a group of patients receiving a placebo. In a platform trial, you test multiple drugs at the same time. So you have maybe 5 or 6 groups of patients receiving drugs, but only one group will receive a placebo drug. So that greatly reduces the proportion of patients not receiving potential treatments. And another big benefit to these trials is that they've expanded the recruitment requirements. So we have a much wider range of patients who are eligible to actually participate in these trials. There's 2 of these currently underway. There's the Healy Centre in the US is running the Healy ALS platform trial. And in Europe, there's a magnet trial being run by the organisation TRICALS. And these are happening in multiple countries around Europe. And there's also a participation, some centres in Australia are also participating in the magnet trial as well. And we're waiting very keenly to see the outcomes of these trials. The advantage is that drugs can just feed continually into these trials as they become deemed suitable to move into the clinical trial process. And the Healy trial is actually testing AMX205, which I referred to previously, which is a drug that was developed in Queensland. And we helped sponsor that. The other really interesting development is antisense oligonucleotides. So as you know, 5 to 10% of patients have a genetic cause underlying their disease. And 3 of the most common genetic causes are defects in the genes SOD1, C9orf72, and FUS. So at the moment, drugs are being developed for all 3 of these genes, and one drug, tofersen, that's targeting SOD1, has just moved into phase 3 clinical trial after very promising results from the phase 2 trial. So we're very excited about the outcomes of these drugs because we know they're targeting the causes of disease, which is always a problem in MND, that we don't know exactly what causes a disease in many cases. In the genetic cases, we know what causes it. If we can target those causes, we're very hopeful that we will see positive outcomes from these drug trials. So we're waiting very keenly to see what happens from the phase 3 trial of tofersen. Another aspect of MND Research Australia is, as the National Research Association, we are part of the International Alliance of the ALS MND Associations. This was founded in 1992 to provide an international community for all the individual associations around the world. And the vision is obviously a world free of ALS. And the idea is that we collate information and provide a global gateway to all our members. A key aspect of the Alliance is to assist less well-developed nations, share best practice. We provide support grants for those nations so they can attend meetings and partner up with other countries and other healthcare providers. Provide an advocacy toolkit to really help those countries advocate for better care and support for patients. And we provide information resources that are collated from all our members, and we're multilingual as well. It's a number of councils, the PALS and CALS Advisory Council, Innovation Technology, and there's also a Scientific Advisory Council of which I am a member. And what we do is we really provide a centralised resource review and provide global perspectives on recent scientific biomedical announcements, provide guidance on all the latest outcomes and sort of discussion topics out there, such as stem cells or off-label drugs, and the tofersen trial as well. And we provide lay descriptions of and summaries of the current situation. It also lets us know about opportunities as well. Drug trials, pharmaceutical companies can come to the SAC and talk to us about how best to run their trials and how best to access patients. And we have representatives from right around the world. So obviously Australia, myself, UK, US, Asia, China, including China, Europe, Canada, and South America and Central America as well. So we're truly an international organisation representing worldwide. So where is the future of MND going to take us? Research going to take us? I think we're going to end up in a situation where personalised medicine is going to be critical. MND is a very heterogeneous disease. And I think with all the different treatments that are hopefully going to come through in the next few years, we'll be able to combine different treatments to treat specific patients and depending upon their symptoms. Rather than having one drug cures all, I don't think that's going to happen. Every patient will be slightly different and will require a different basically battery of drugs. We're hoping that will be available in the next few years. As I said before, better diagnosis. We'll diagnose patients earlier and be able to get them onto the effective drugs as soon as possible, and hopefully slow the disease before it's done as much damage as unfortunately is currently the case. And also disease monitoring, be able to follow that disease and really see if the treatments are working or not. And the better care models such as NIV and hopefully other care models will continue to be developed as well for those patients where the disease has already developed. In Australia, the platform trial, we really want to run our own platform trial in Australia, and we're currently working to get that funded. We have the MindOz organisation, which is really a national patient registry combining with SALSA, the genetic studies, and to really improve that to increase our data collection. So we can basically have every patient in Australia registered in that. And so we get details from the patients and their carers about how their disease is progressing, how they're responding to treatments, and that provide us with a really strong database to be able to identify how better to both treat and provide care for patients, and also provides a fantastic resource for people to enter into clinical trials. We can identify who is best suited for which trial. We're also hoping to run a national MND Research Summit where we're going to have a very strong patient voice, meet with clinicians and researchers to identify the best way forward, identify priorities for research, and see how best we can use our resources here in Australia. And finally, I'm very keen to work with other neurodegenerative disease organisations such as dementia, Parkinson's, MS, to really advocate together for better support for neurodegenerative disease, such as making aged care fair. Research synergies is really important. There's a lot of synergy or a lot of similarities between some of these diseases. So can we really combine our research sources to attack problems together? And by working together, we'll increase our profile and hopefully increase the amount of government funding we can receive for our research. So that's where I'll stop today, and I really look forward to answering any questions you might have. So thank you. Okay, right. Seems that we have quite a few questions, so I'll jump straight in. First question from David Cox. Are there clinical trials for people who have the primary lateral sclerosis phenotype? Not that I'm aware at the moment. I think most of the trials are just looking at sort of more generic MND, but I will go away and double check that, and I will come back to you if I do find something out, David. Next question, what's the update on stem cell research? So currently the probably most prominent stem cell trial is the neurone trial from Brainstorm, which is actually putting stem cells in that produce neurotrophic factors to try and boost the motor neuron. That's just got into, it's actually in phase 3 trial at the moment, and the last update was they finished recruiting all the patients and they've all received their first treatment, I think. So those trials are ongoing. There's also some phase 2 trials from another company in Israel, Kurdistan, that are also looking at stem cells. So it's ongoing, and we're looking forward to seeing the results from the phase 3 trial. Aileen Thompson is an involuntary scream, which I have, very common, and anything I could do to curb this embarrassing symptom. Look, I'm not a neurologist, but I believe there is a drug called Neodexter, which can be prescribed by your neurologist, which I think should help that aspect of your condition. So talk to your neurologist. Neodexter, Nuedexta. Next one, Victoria asks, hello, do you see this product Neurone to ever be available in Australia, and will it be affordable? I think if it passes through the clinical trials and is approved, there's no reason it shouldn't be approved in Australia. And hopefully if there is a strong enough response, as in it is a truly effective drug, then you'd hope that it would become available on the PBS. Obviously, it is a very expensive drug, but that has happened for the genetic therapies for, say, SMA, which I think was something like $1 million of treatment. So there is definitely scope for very expensive therapies to be approved on the PBS. Next one, are there any other current trials, this is a question from Lisa, researching a cure for MND as distinct from relief of symptoms? The challenge with that is we still don't know what causes MND in, 90% of the cases. So at the moment, there's no specific drug being developed that will cure MND. However, for the genetic cases, we do know the gene that is underlying it, and certainly has a significant contribution. So those drugs, such as the tofersen for SOD1, are currently in phase 3 trial. What I would hope in the future is that we'd be able to use those drugs to treat people who we know have the genetic mutation before they develop symptoms, or certainly very early on in their symptom development. So if the drugs are effective, we'd hope we'd be able to halt the disease very early in the process, or if we know it is safe, we perhaps can use it as a preventative disease in genetic cases. Perhaps as a complete cure, the SAPs are the strongest option at the moment, but they certainly, the phase 2 and the early data have not shown it to be an absolute cure at the moment. Another question, what studies are showing the most promise for people living with MND? As I said, the platform trials are looking very promising. They're allowing us to reduce the number of placebo patients, and also testing multiple patients at the same time. And also letting us use equipment much more effectively. Secondly, as I've already said a couple of times, I think it's the genetic approaches, the gene therapy approaches are probably our best bet for seeing some serious traction in treating MND. Next question from Joe down in Victoria. What is happening with the transition from the MND registry to SALSA? So SALSA is actually being rolled into the MND registry, and they're being combined into a program called MNDOS. So this has been supported by a grant from the National Health and Medical Research Council. And the idea there is that we'll be collecting all the genetic data from our patients as well as all the clinical data and be able to combine this. And this will also involve, part of it will involve patients uploading their own data so we can follow the patient journey. And that will be incredibly powerful to see exactly how people respond to different treatments, how their symptoms progress, and how we can correlate that with any genetic phenotypes. Question from Rebecca. I carry the SOD1 gene. It runs in my family. Will ever be the clinical trials for us? Yes, the Tofson trial is ongoing at the moment in Australia. I think it's been run out of at least one centre in Sydney and possibly other centres. So if you talk to a neurologist, they will be able to put you in touch with the right people to get on that trial. That drug is currently in phase 3, and I believe they're hoping to have that trial finishing close to the end of this year, and we should see some data coming out next year. Has there been any slowdown in MND research due to COVID? I don't think we're seeing money being diverted directly for MND research into COVID research, but we've certainly seen, obviously, with the shutdowns of laboratories, etc., we have seen some slowdown in lab research. The lab researchers are very resourceful. They've gone off and used their time to write up papers, to write grants, to analyse their data. And the really critical studies, such as some of the animal model stuff, has kept going, and they just sort of slowed it down a little. And they've also been doing things like shift work coming into the lab to make sure that they're not having too many people in the lab. A lot of the clinical work has continued. Again, the clinicians have been very resourceful and worked out the way they can adapt their protocols to involve social distancing and be COVID safe. So some of the trials had to be briefly halted, such as Tofson, because it involves a spinal injection, but other drugs which can perhaps be already delivered, such as copper ATSM, the patients have been able to receive those their drugs in the post and carry on with their trials. And also the monitoring of patients, they've switched quite smoothly in a lot of cases to telemedicine, and hopefully this will actually be very useful in the future. I thought we had another question about rural patients in regional areas. I think certainly one benefit of the COVID pandemic has shown us how powerful telemedicine can be, how you can have Zoom consultations. So we're really hoping in the future that this will expand the accessibility of our regional patients to both research trials, drug trials, and access to expert neurologists when they need them. All right, final question. As a person with MND, what studies are currently available to me? So I've talked about a number of different clinical trials. There's also, if you talk to a neurologist, you can get involved in the patient registry and the MNDOS study. And this will allow you to contribute your samples and your MND journey into a database, which will really allow us to, we're trying to collect all the patients in Australia into this database, which will give us an incredibly powerful resource to be able to see what's working and what doesn't work, which is obviously in the end what we really need to know. So I'd like to now pass you on to Vicki Flood, and I'll be back for the panel questions at the end. Thank you for your time.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Professor Vicki Flood. Vicki's a conjoint professor at the University of Sydney and Westmead Hospital and Western Sydney Local Health District. Vicki has a background in nutrition science and dietetics, epidemiology and public health, and research areas including clinical trials to reduce chronic disease and neurodegenerative diseases. A recent research of motor neurone disease has had a multidisciplinary focus, working with Professor Steve Vucic and allied health clinicians and academics at Westmead Hospital, St Joseph's Hospital and the University of Sydney. Vicki has over 170 peer-reviewed publications and supervises several research students. Vicki is passionate about applying research into the clinical context and translating research into practice. She will present on the recent trial of swallowing exercises and diet intervention among people living with motor neurone disease. Thanks, Vicki.
And I'm very pleased to be here to share with you some of our research findings with you. I'm sharing preliminary findings from a pilot study. It's on swallowing exercises and diet modifications for people living with motor neurone disease. And I'd like to acknowledge the important research funding support that we've had for this project from the MND Research Institute of Australia. So it is well established from the literature and people who live with motor neurone disease that swallowing function and nutrition problems are ongoing cause of difficulty for people with motor neurone disease. Up to 85% of people with MND are affected by swallowing function, or otherwise known as dysphagia, and malnutrition increases the risk for mortality. And dysphagia comes about from a combination of weakness from the lower motor neuron or spasticity from the upper motor neurons, and that loss of function and the connectivity between the cortex and the messaging to the muscles. Swallowing problems and poor nutrition contribute to poor muscle function, and it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. So it causes fatigue and weight loss and impacts on quality of life. This is best managed through a multidisciplinary care team, and that's been described previously in the literature also. We also know from other evidence that moderate intensity aerobic exercise and respiratory muscle strengthening studies are promising for supporting quality of life and function, and may slow progression of motor neuron disease. Around the same time as this emerging evidence on exercise and MND, there's been some interesting research conducted in mouse models of mice with MND. And this work that was published by Oliver et al. In the Journal of Nutrition and Biochemistry, and they found that mice who were fed extra virgin olive oil compared to other types of fats and other types of diets, they had increased survival rate and improved motor function, motor coordination, and lower muscle atrophy or less muscle wastage. And just to give you a little bit of a further example of that particular study, the mice who received the extra virgin olive oil had a survival day that was 143 days almost, compared to the 132 days in the palm oil diets, or compared to the chow diets, which was significantly different. So we were interested in exploring the combination of looking at this exercise and diet interventions. And we often get asked, well, why is extra virgin olive oil important? We already know from other research in neurodegenerative diseases, and I've done some of this research myself, and looking at cognitive function in people with, at risk of Alzheimer's disease, that extra virgin olive oil can be important for slowing progression of the disease, and it plays a role. And this has been shown in clinical trials previously, as well as observation research. It reduces inflammation, reduces insulin resistance, so people have a better glucose response with the extra virgin olive oil on board. They have higher phenolic compounds. The extra virgin olive oil itself is quite high in phenolic compounds, which acts as like as an antioxidant in the body, and that's the sort of dark green colour that you see in extra virgin olive oils. So in terms of exercises, of course, we know muscle strengthening helps by resistance and repetition, and potentially we feel it could support improved swallow function, and we're interested to see that combined effect of nutrition and exercise together. So just to unpack that a little bit further about why the extra virgin olive oil is important for the motor neuron itself, there's been some nice research previously discussed in neurodegeneration where they've described a healthy neuron and shown a picture of a healthy neuron where the motor neurons there with the nucleus and the Golgi that transport and give signals across the axon to our muscles. That's what a healthy motor neuron looks like. In the lower part of this figure, an unhealthy motor neuron, as occurs in MND, starts to get interrupted with those messaging or that signaling across the axonal pathway. And this is thought to be caused by interruption of a component, or among other things, one of the reasons might be around a component of the motor neuron itself called the Golgi apparatus, or sometimes the Golgi, and that becomes fragmented. And that in turn works with another part of the motor neuron called the endoplasmic reticulum. And in that mouse study that I told you about previously, get that figure up, they wanted to understand why the olive oil was working in the mice. And they measured these components of the endoplasmic reticulum as via stress markers that are presented in the stressed motor neuron. And in the dark bar is the extra virgin olive oil group, and if it's higher on the table, then that means it's more stressed. And you can see that the dark bar from the olive oil compared to the chow diet or the control diet, or compared to the palm oil diet, has a much lower level of stress in that endoplasmic reticulum compared to those alternative diets. So that was part of the mechanism that they hypothesized why it was being effective, and they saw the improved muscle function and longer life. Now, putting all that together, we came up with this study of looking at the feasibility of investigating moderate intensity swallowing exercise combined with a diet that was modelled on that mouse diet of 20% of calories from extra virgin olive oil, assessing swallow function and assessing weight and quality of life. So our basic study design was to look at randomly ask people to participate in and assign them to different groups of intervention. So some people received a random allocation to an exercise-only group. Some people who had motor neuron disease received an allocation to an olive oil group, and some people received a combined grouping. And then we assessed their outcome measures. So everyone was receiving something that we thought would be effective, and then we looked again at 3 months later. In terms of what we measured in the people who were participating in the study, we looked at their swallow function, measured by looking at a fibroendoscopic evaluation of their swallowing, which is a little tube that goes down their nose and takes a picture at the back of their throat of their swallow function, if they'd be given water or yogurt. And then we had a 3-day diet food record, so quite a detailed dietary assessment of their usual diet intake at the beginning. We measured their usual speech and voice. We measured body composition and function and quality of life. And then the interventions that we provided were based either on swallowing exercise intervention or the diet intervention. So in terms of the swallowing exercise intervention, they received 8 treatment sessions in 4 weeks. So twice a week they received some exercises that were provided with instructions about how to follow, and that was conducted using a surface electromyography. So this is where some wires are placed on the throat or around the muscles of the swallow function, and then the individual's asked to look on a screen, and they can see the muscle contracting as they're asked to do the exercise manoeuvres, and that helps to give them a feedback to continue to do that exercise. This needs to be very carefully monitored and supported by an experienced speech pathologist, and who's able to adjust and make sure that a patient's not getting overtired, and we adjusted it based on their ability to do the exercise, and we're watching carefully in relation to fatigue. The diet intervention was an extra virgin olive oil intervention that was based on the 20% of energy, as I've mentioned previously. And for most people, this was averaged out to be about 3 to 4 tablespoons per day for the majority of the participants. And then we use good quality extra virgin olive oil, and we provided information about that. So I've given you a little example of the extra virgin olive oil that we suggested for people to use. It's got quite dark green in colour, and I don't have any shares with this particular company, but it's just sort of a bit of an example of where you can look, what you can look for. That's something that's fresh, that's been reasonably recently harvested is what you're looking for. And we gave them tailored advice about diet habits and swallow function and a focus on soft foods as required, with provision of recipes and behaviour change by their dietitian. And so here's a bit of information about the people who participated. The first thing you'll notice when you look at this table is that we had, this is only a pilot study, so we only had 17 people who participated that were presenting research results of today. So their average age was 65 years. They were mostly males. They had a moderate ALSFR score rating of 34.9. They were predominantly bulbar onset people with motor neuron disease, and their baseline intake of extra virgin olive oil was around 5%. You might remember we're going to ask them to go up to 20%. And they had a baseline intake of around 10,000 kilojoules. In terms of answering that first question about whether is it feasible for people to adhere to a diet of 20% of calories from olive oil, well, we can see here in this red and blue line, they're both people who had the diet intervention or no diet intervention were around 5 to 6% of their baseline intake was olive oil. But what you'll see is the people who in the blue who received the diet intervention, they were able to get close to that 20% of calories, 18.8%. Of course, the people who weren't given the specific diet instructions also increased their olive oil because they knew we were doing an olive oil study. But they didn't increase it to the same extent as those who were given the specific instructions. We see overall in the diet changes that there was an overall increase in kilojoule intake, so extra calories, and more so among the diet group compared to the exercise group. And predominantly this is extra calories from fat, that would be in keeping with the higher olive oil, and predominantly the main type of fat that's in olive oil is called monounsaturated fatty acids, and so you see this increase in the monounsaturated fatty acids. So that again just reinforces and tells us that they're adhering to that diet that we're advising them to follow. One of the main measures for quality of life that we used was EQ5D. This is a scale that looks at mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain and anxiety. It's a fairly simple quality of life scale that asks people to respond whether they're in 5 different ways, whether that's so this is an example question for anxiety and depression. I'm not anxious or depressed, I'm slightly anxious or depressed, or moderately, severely or extremely. Now, because we had fairly small numbers participating in our study so far, we combined the moderately severe and extreme group and categorise that as findings. And this figure here represents anyone who responded as moderate, severe or extreme to any of those 5 elements of the quality of life. And so you can see, generally speaking, there was quite a high proportion of people who were indicating that they were moderate, severe or extremely concerned about these elements of their quality of life. But the big thing that we noticed, if anyone who participated in the study had a big reduction in this anxiety component of quality of life. So they were less anxious and less depressed if they were participated in any part of the study. And this is really reflecting that people want to be able to do something about what's going on and feel that they're been able to make some contribution in relation to their health. But the big part of the study that we were really interested to investigate was, did this make a difference in relation to swallow function? And what we have found among some of the participants who were in that combined exercise and diet group, they either maintained their swallow function and some of them had less pharyngeal residue. We didn't see that in the group that was in the exercise only or the diet only groups. And so here's a picture of an example of a participant who was successful in having improved pharyngeal residue, so less pharyngeal residue. So what you see is the baseline picture of the inside their mouth with the yogurt pooling, so they're not swallowing that yogurt cleanly. Then this is a follow-up after they've participated in the study with the combined exercise and diet together. And you can see that they now are able to swallow more successfully. We did have a look to see if this was also replicated in a symptom score, and so higher score is better. So we see an improvement between 77 to 79.8 in the follow-up score, but that NS means it's not significant statistically. So that probably reflects the fact that we had small numbers. We need to see more numbers to see if that's meaningful. And similarly, we were interested to see if the people who were in the diet group also had an improved score for their weight or had improved weight. And we see some indication that it may improve weight, so shifting from 0.1 to 0.8 among the people who received the diet intervention. But again, that was not statistically significant. And that, again, that also reflects the small numbers probably in this study. So what we'd like to sort of conclude from this is it is a study of small numbers. It's a pilot study. We do need more numbers to confirm these findings. We probably would make sure we'd be targeting patients who are early in their diagnosis, and we might tweak some of the elements of the intervention a little. These are early results, so they are suggestive that targeted exercise and diet are feasible and may improve swallow function and weight status among some people with motor neuron disease. And it is really important to be doing that in the context of a multidisciplinary care and providing that care to help support ongoing improved quality of life. That's what we would like to see anyone with MND having access to. We'd really like to acknowledge the many participants and their families and their time and effort to participate in this study. We couldn't do it without you. I'd also like to acknowledge my collaborators, Dr. Hans Bogart, a speech pathologist at the University of Sydney, Timothy Allow, research assistant, Kirsty Niven, the speech pathologist from Westmead Hospital, Rachel Hemman, the dietitian from Westmead Hospital at the time, and Parvathi Menon and Professor Steve Vucci, neurologists at Westmead Hospital. Thank them so much for their ongoing collaborations and support of this study. And yeah, we couldn't have done this work without the MND Research Institute of Australia and the Jenny Simcoe MND Research Grant. So shout out to the MND Research Institute of Australia. So next steps for us is to be thinking about what else could be important from an exercise and nutrition intervention for people living with MND, and we're currently exploring a systematic review of exercise and nutrition interventions, and we'll be looking to publish on that shortly. So I think now it's time to find out if you've got any questions to follow up in relation to this research project. Hi there. Thanks for this first question from Stephanie about help with speech therapy. So speech therapy support is an important part of the multidisciplinary team support that for people with MND. So they can help with communication and information around communication devices, but they can also be very important in terms of supporting and treating dysphagia and giving advice around and assessing dysphagia, so swallowing problems for a person with MND. So they should hook into their neurologist with a multidisciplinary team in terms of getting support for speech therapy. In terms of the actual exercises we had assessed in this project, they need to be very carefully monitored by a speech pathologist. Next question. Are there any important supplements you would recommend while waiting for approved treatments? Yeah, so this is part of the, we explored this question in the systematic review that we've conducted of all clinical trials of exercise and nutrition trials. And many of the nutrition trials were based on supplements, but not all of them were. And so a few supplements give some promising indication, but what really you should do is talk about any planned supplements that you might be interested in taking with your neurologist and an expert dietitian in the field, and to make sure that that's not going to interfere with anything else that you're consuming or planning in terms of treatment. There is some promising work in supplements, but also needs some further investigation. And that was what we were unpacking in our systematic review. Due to muscle waste, is it worth working with weights to exercise or to build muscle tone? From Tom. Thanks, Tom, for that question. Yeah, so in terms of exercise, that was part of that systematic review that I just alluded to too. And it looks like there's a window of time when it could be quite important to do moderate intensity exercise, including weights. That, again, would need to be carefully done in conjunction with a physiotherapist in your team, and to make sure you're not over-fatiguing yourself. So just doing the same principles with the swallowing muscles, not to have over-fatigue them. It's just to get them to a certain level in a window of time when probably early in diagnosis would be a good time to be doing it. So is there any other questions there? Oh, here we go, from Hayden. Hello, where do I get the olive oil that you mentioned? And yeah, so look, we were purposely wanting to choose an olive oil that was readily available for people. So we used Cobram Estate olive oil that's just available in the supermarket shelves. I do recommend people go for a high phenolic content of their olive oil. And this little 3-layered drop version of olive oil, it has a high phenolic compound, and it's important that it's extra virgin olive oil. That doesn't have to be that brand. It just happens to be that's an Australian brand that's readily available on the supermarket shelves. It could be another brand that I would recommend that it's something that's being locally produced because it's more likely to be fresh. You can also check on the side of your bottle to see when it was harvested. A lot of people don't realise that information's on the side of the bottle. So this one was harvested in December 2019. So you want to look for something that's been harvested reasonably recently. So any quantities. So is there a recommendation around the quantity of extra virgin olive oil? So we were aiming in our study for 20% of calories of extra virgin olive oil. So we carefully assessed people's energy intake to find out what would be 20% of their calories. We based the 20% of calorie guideline on the mouse study that had been done in Oliver et al., where they had identified that 20% of the calories was a good target amount in the mice study of SOD1 mice. And that is similar to a very traditional Mediterranean diet, and that's that quantity. So we thought it would be feasible for people to consume that, and indeed we did find that. So 20% of calories for most people translates to about 3 to 4 tablespoons. Is coconut oil better or as good as olive oil? So the reason why the work that's been done in extra virgin olive oil, or one of the mechanisms or the components of the olive oil that we think is very important, are the phenolic compounds. And the big phenolic compound that's in extra virgin olive oil is hydroxytyrosol. That particular phenolic compound is the only phenolic compound that crosses the blood-brain barrier, and that's why we think it might be very important in this disease and in other neurological diseases, because you see in similar diseases in other ones. So that phenolic compound is not found to the same extent in coconut oil or anywhere near the same extent. So it's something that's particularly high in extra virgin olive oil. I think I might have answered a question previously about supplements, but are there any other nutrients when increasing olive oil? Look, as I've indicated, we have done a systematic review and we're looking at other nutrients, and we're interested to explore that further. I'm very interested in a nutrient called lutein that's in dark green leafy vegetables because there was a study that came out of the US where they combined all the cohort studies of a number of cohort studies. They had 1 million people, and they had looked at the 1,000 people that developed motor neuron disease. And if you were less likely to develop motor neuron disease if you were consuming more of the nutrient lutein, which is found in dark green leafy vegetables. So look, that's just a little indication. That was from foods. It's a little indication there may be some other promising nutrients. They need further investigations and trials. So we don't know for sure, but it's interesting from an observation research that has been identified. What can I do to reduce the thick phlegmy consistency I have in the back of my throat at night time? I would really recommend that you hook into a multidisciplinary team that has a speech pathologist. And as we did investigate that phlegm that you're experiencing in those specialist exercises, but there seems to be a window of time when it might be useful. It needs to be supervised by a speech pathologist. How were participants consuming EVO, cooking on it, salads? How many meals did people need to swallow? Yeah, so they were having about 3 to 4 tablespoons a day, which is about 50 to 60 meals a day. They were doing a whole range of different things with it. Mostly people were using it in cooking or adding it to things like soups. We had a really nice dark green leafy vegetable soup with olive oil in it. So that was easy to swallow for people, but they were putting it into cooking. They might have cooked an omelette with some eggs. Sometimes people find it difficult to eat the salad, so we would recommend salads if people could consume salads and use it as a dressing, but it was sometimes difficult for people to do it. Sometimes you can add it to the end of your cooking if you're doing something like a soup, and put it as a drizzle over the top. You can actually cook with olive oil up to about 200 degrees Celsius, and it's after that point that it actually starts to reach a smoke point. It's not safe to cook with after about 200 degrees. But 200 degrees Celsius is quite hot. You normally would cook much lower temperatures than that. So what's next steps in this research? So we're having a look at what we can do and take and learn and apply from that systematic review that I referred to, and where there's gaps in information. So one of the things we were particularly looking for when we did the systematic review, to see if there was any combination of exercise and nutrition interventions happening at the same time, and there was none. So that's why we think it's actually really important to help the nutrition of the cell at the same time of that you're providing exercise. So we're interested to look at the combination of the effect of exercise and nutrition together. So what's my advice now for people living with MND and extra virgin olive oil? I would actually recommend that you do consider including extra virgin olive oil regularly in your diet. It's not going to be harmful. It's likely to be helpful in terms of an energy source, from a calorie source. It's likely to be helpful, and it may be helpful from a point of view of the phenolic compounds that are in it as well. We're still exploring that further, but the pilot study is promising in that respect. So we're just wrapping up into our panel discussion now. So I think we're going to have all the other speakers come and join me now online. So hello everyone, we're back again. and we've got Ashley, Rosie and Gethin to answer your questions.
All right, so how has COVID impacted the work for me? Well, for me, being in the clinic and actually face-to-face seeing patients, I have found that obviously, MND patients are in such a high-risk group that a lot of them haven't been coming and wanting to come actually physically to the clinics. So we have been doing a lot of that by telehealth and being able to see people that way through the various technologies available to us.
Yeah, and look, we found something similar to that, Rosie, so that it's given us an opportunity to think about how we could do our research differently, yeah, and to see if there's a way we can reach out and do telehealth. Gethin, you alluded to that previously when you were answering some questions, and for sure I think it's opened up some opportunities there, but it has slowed down the face-to-face element of doing research during COVID.
Yeah, I agree, Vicki, and it's I think there are certainly pros and cons of what's happening, but I think in future we will be able to, I guess, adapt a lot more to working with people from more regional areas, for example, in being able to involve them in different research projects. What about you, Gethin?
So for MND Australia, a lot of our work is pretty much office-based, where the whole team is office-based. So we moved to remote working pretty smoothly. Biggest concern for me is research and the research we fund. So we put a few new sort of funding opportunities in place to try and support our researchers who may have lost some time and lost some funding during the COVID pandemic. So we're trying to make sure we do support the researchers while they have been impacted more than we have. So next question, David Cox, one of my recent clients, has asked me to raise two questions. The first one is, how many of the expert researchers have MND or care for someone with MND also? From my point of view, I cannot confess to having any direct MND experience. I've been in this role for a year now. My personal expertise is research management. My job is to make sure that we use the resources we have for research as well as possible. And another critical aspect of that, I think, is that we really hear the lived experience voice as well as possible. So I'm very aware of that we're not experts. All our researchers are brilliant experts in their own fields, but obviously not many of them have direct experience. So we need to hear that voice loud and clear, and we're having a we're planning a research summit at this time, and we will be inviting representatives of the of PALs and CALs to that summit to make sure that we hear their voice. Anyone else got some comments on that?
I'm in the same boat in terms of my personal experience with motor neurone disease. I've been here at the clinic for the last 2 years, working directly with patients and their families. But from my personal experience, I've not worked with someone with, I've not cared for someone with motor neurone disease.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I haven't cared for someone with motor neurone disease, but we've seen a number of people with motor neurone disease in the course of doing the research and working with them, but not cared for them directly. So not an expert in that sense, more bringing my expertise around on nutrition and research and in clinical trials and other neurodegenerative diseases, but not an expert in understanding and hearing all those experiences other than what we hear when we talk to people in the research context.
Absolutely. And look, the next question from Simon, what is the latest feedback from the copper ATSM trial? Gethin, would you be the person to ask about that?
Yep, so the current CTU copper ATSM trial is underway. It's a phase 2/3 trial, and I believe it's going well. It actually was not impacted too badly by COVID because it's an oral medication. So I heard that actually we're mailing some of the treatments out to patients rather than bring them into the clinic. I know a couple of patients have finished the trial and they've moved on to the extension phase at the moment. So that's where you're guaranteed to have the actual medication. So I think it's due to finish up this year, and we hope to hear the results early next year to see if it's worked or not.
So what are the next steps for each of us? Sorry, Gethin, did you want to go?
No, please.
I mean, for myself, the next steps are just to continue to work with the patients and our families and their families here in the clinic. We also have a research arm here through the MND Research Clinic and so I'm continuing to sort of encourage people to be able to give us their samples to continue the research that's going on here as well.
I guess from my perspective, I'm a PhD student, as you might have heard at the start. So I'm about to start a new project where, speaking of experts, I'll be hoping to recruit consumer experts, meaning patients and their family members. So anyone who has had genetic testing, I guess I'm interested to hear about your experience. I've done interviews with patients and families in the past, but the whole goal of the PhD really is to come up with a model of care, so a way that instructs health professionals what is required in genetic testing and counselling, and helping to support patients and families along that way. So if you're interested, get in touch.
Yeah, from my perspective, we'll be taking on that work that we've been doing on looking at exercise and nutrition and that gap that we've identified, and looking to explore that in a future research study. So that we're planning that at the moment.
I think for MND Research Australia, two big priorities coming up are, one, the research summit I met before. We're going to bring in researchers, patients, clinicians, industry, funding bodies, all into the same room to work out what are our research priorities and how should we go about them to make sure we get the biggest bang for our buck. The second one is I really want to build relationships with the other neurodegenerative disease areas such as Dementia Australia, Parkinson's. There's a lot of MS, there's a lot of crossover in some of the symptoms and treatments for these diseases. And if we all work together, hopefully we can, one, leverage more money out of the government, and two, identify areas where we can really build our research, bring out better research results. So is this the final question, or are we still going? I think
we've got one more before the final.
Do you want me to respond to that question? Future
Yes,
work exploring connections with functional medicine, including naturopaths and dietitians. So dietitians are already part of multidisciplinary clinic teams, and certainly some of the research I've referred to today would have a connection with dietitian. I'm less familiar with work that's happening in the naturopath area. I don't know if anyone else knows of any work that's happening in the naturopath connection, but I think a personalised medicine approach will be an approach that we'll be pursuing in research generally for MND.
So now we're up to our final question. Some of the big challenges in motor neurone disease research. Gethin, did you want to?
Yeah, look, so I think I've alluded to it before. The biggest challenge we have is that we don't actually know what causes MND, and it's an incredibly heterogeneous disease. So I think, but we do have over 80 drugs currently in clinical trial. So we're hoping that some of these will come to fruition, and that will give us a battery of treatments to allow us to give us this personalized medicine approach that we want to be able to treat the symptoms, the combination of symptoms for each individual patient as well as possible. The second big challenge is really we need something to show that MND is not intractable, and I'm hoping that the genetic therapies will do that. And I think once we can show that MND is indeed a treatable disease, we will start seeing other drug companies, the big pharmaceutical companies, coming into the area to bring in their huge resources to really push the area along, and I think then we'll see an acceleration of developments in MND research.
Yeah, and just from my perspective, I think, if we see that acceleration of the research happening in the pharmaceutical end, that'll open up opportunities for the model of care that's provided for people with MND, and allow further investigations for that multidisciplinary model of care with a slower progress of the disease that could come about from the other treatments that are on offer. So that's what I see some of the future going to. So I think we're wrapping up our panel discussion now, and we're going to hear soon from Graham Opie to help us wrap up. But thank you everyone for joining us online. This has been a huge experiment for us all, huge learning curve, and we really appreciate all the people and the behind the scenes making it all happen. And if we didn't get to some of your questions, we'll be online looking at them in the coming days, and we'll be giving you a bit more of a written response too. So thanks for participating and joining us online.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
First online MND New South Wales Ask the Experts session to an end. Thank you to our 4 presenters for presenting and answering questions, and for your flexibility in moving to present online. All the presenters have said if there are any questions they haven't answered, they'd be happy to do so by responding to your comments online in the coming days. Ask the Experts 2020 can be viewed again from our MND New South Wales Facebook page or YouTube channel. And a reminder to please provide feedback, as we'd like to be able to improve future online information sessions. Thanks to all of you who are watching and those who've asked questions. And thank you from MND New South Wales.